Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition. We are now at poem 467, We Do Not Play on Graves. And can we just point out, few poets know how to come up with a first line like Emily does. We do not play on graves. And in some ways we're back to 465, aren't we? I heard a fly buzz when I died. Once again, this is another one of our death poems, right? And you'll maybe remember in our study of 465, I pointed out that at the age of 21, Emily wrote to her friend Jane Humphrey the following quote, "The other day I tried to think how I should look with my eyes shut and a little white gown on and a snowdrop on my breast, and I fancied I heard the neighbors stealing in so softly to look down on my face, so fast asleep, so still." Emily imagining what it would be like to be witnessed as dead in her own bed. Emily spends quite a bit of time thinking and musing about death, but from different perspectives. And here she'll bring the word death and the word play together, which is going to obviously be a bit of a challenge for us as we think about it. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you worked through our set of introductory comments as well as the preceding 466 poems. We just finished 466, "'Tis Little I Could Care for Pearls." Now, Emily lived, just to remind, Emily lived in a house that was adjacent to a cemetery. Okay, so she grew up all her life looking at tombstones, all right? And some people have said, oh, well, that explains a lot of her somewhat Gothic orientation to death and the like, all right? By the way, Emily herself ends up buried in the graveyard in Amherst, and the language on her tombstone is called back. Some would say that they should have said called back to play, because it is clear that one of the things Emily's doing in her poetry is playing. Guys, I keep saying this. I cannot help but believe she's having a pretty good time as she's writing some of this stuff, knowing that whoever's going to read it after she's gone, because remember, she doesn't share any of these poems with hardly anybody until after she's dead. And then, of course, people discover the poems and the like. She had to have been playing much of the time while she was doing that. Now, Emily, as we've said, was a great reader of biblical text. And some of you will maybe remember in the biblical story of the Exodus that you will have the children of Israel there camping at the base of the mountain that is referred to as Sinai, later Horeb. And that there's a fascinating moment that will happen as Moses gets ready to go up onto Mount Sinai to collect what will be called the 10 Commandments. And we're told in Exodus 32, 5 through 8, the following. I'll read from the King James Version because that's the version Emily knew. "And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, 'Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord.'" By the way, they make this golden calf, okay, as it's referred to. And now to continue with Exodus. "And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play." It's one of the only times in the biblical corpus that the word play gets used at all. And here it is, how? What does it mean? They ate, they drank, and they rose up to play. Well, this is the King James's attempt to suggest that the people were doing naughty, right? In other words, play here is some kind of sexual rendering. It isn't a positive, it's a negative. Verse 7, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Go thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." In other words, play, equal sign, corruption. "They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made unto them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." Emily knew this passage. She knew it well. She understood that in the biblical corpus, play is almost always associated with something negative, not positive. And yet, notice what she says, "We do not play on graves." Let's just read the poem. "We do not play on graves because there isn't room. Besides, it isn't even, it slants. And people come and put a flower on it, hang their faces so. We're fearing that their hearts will drop and crush our pretty play. And so we move as far as enemies away, just looking round to see how far it is occasionally." Now the word picture here is quite amazing. She's speaking as a child, and she says, we don't really play on the graves. Now maybe because they've been instructed, but that isn't what she says. She says the reason we don't play on graves is because it slants, which is interesting. Let's study it. First of all, the we is fascinating because it isn't clear who she's referencing. Notice it's not I. It's not I don't play on graves, it's we don't play on graves. But who specifically is she referencing? Many have interpreted this as the voice of Emily as child, which she uses regularly. We do not play on graves, which again, our use of the word play takes us back to poem 75. She died at play, gambled away, or lease of spotted hours. Or when we did 244, you'll maybe remember this one. It is easy to work when the soul is at play. One of the amazing lines of Emily, right, from 244. We do not play on graves, okay? And again, if this is the voice of a child, then consider her knowledge of the Matthew 19:14 passage, suffer the children to come unto me, for such are the kingdom of heaven. Notice here, children like to play, and yet play but not on graves. Notice she doesn't say in graveyards, she says play on the graves. And then she'll say, because there isn't room, which is bizarre. What do you mean there isn't room? Cemeteries are usually fairly expansive. That's why they're used as cemeteries. There isn't room. What is she saying? Room to run and play? Besides, and this is why we call our series Chats with Emily, it's almost like a throwaway line. Besides, it isn't even. It slants. Now, when we get to poem 1129, tell the truth, but tell all the truth, but tell it slant, her use of the word slant is quite brilliant. And that's why many people have read this poem as not literal, but symbolic. In other words, there's certain topics we're not supposed to play around. And we're supposed to leave those topics alone. Why? Because they kind of slant. In other words, they can get you in a little bit of trouble. And you can recognize the ironic possible voice here of Emily. In other words, I know I'm not supposed to play around these because there's not enough room, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then she says, people come, as opposed to them. This is some would say adults. People come, put a flower on it. Put a flower on what? On the grave. And hang their faces so. This will take us back to the witnessing that will happen in 465, you'll recall. Put a flower on it. Hang their faces so. The word so is fascinating. It's almost like she's been studying or watching how adults behave when people die and go to the cemetery. She saw it a lot as a child growing up, as we said, living next to a cemetery. We're fearing that their hearts will drop and crush our pretty play. In other words, as children, they cry so hard at the graveside, we're afraid that they might die. And that would get in the way of our play. Amazing, amazing little poem. And so, all of that to say, we move as far as enemies away. In other words, we distance ourselves, right? We leave the graveyard. We leave the experience of watching these adults who are obviously mourning, just looking round as they're leaving to see how far it is occasionally. In other words, we take one last look. Why? Well, children are kind of enamored of death. If you ever talk to a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, they like to talk about death if you ever get them talking about it, because they're enamored about it, just like you were. Why? Because one minute you're here and the next minute you're not. Well, what do you mean you're not? Like, where do you go? That is a question a child asks an adult, and the adult will begin to have to invent what? Some kind of answer that usually comes down to a story or something. And yet, you have not met any 200-year-old people, as we say in 303. Which means you only get to swing at the park for a very brief period of time. And as they taught you when you were very young, you got to go to the band. I don't want to go to the band. I want to stay swinging at the park. No, honey, you cannot swing at the park forever. You got to go to the band. They were teaching this idea to us, and here she says, occasionally we look back. Why? Because there's a recognition moment that whatever it is they're going through, we soon will go through. This is the nature of living. Can we say it out loud? This is the nature of play. You only get to play for a very short period of time, and then you gotta go. And occasionally, it helps to remember that. Now, when we get to the very end of our collection, we're going to hit a couple of poems that play around, no pun intended, with this same idea. 1703 will read like this. 'Twas comfort in her dying room to hear the living clock, a short relief to have the wind walk boldly up and knock, division from the dying theme to hear the children play, but wrong the more that these could live and this of ours must die. And when we get to poem 17:19, she'll play it this way. God is indeed a jealous God. He cannot bear to see that we had rather not with him, but with each other play. Now, again, we'll come back to this use of the word play later. What are we going to say about this poem at 2a? I think the argument that she's making is that life is precious. Children understand this far better than adults. We have a tendency as adults to actually think that we're going to live a long, long time. Children have this sense, this awareness. Life is precious in each of its moments. At 2b, well, there is this vague antecedent of the word we. I mean, who is the we that she's referencing? Is she talking about children? Is she talking about poets? Read this poem later for yourself and think about the we as artists who love to play, even though others cry and mourn. But even artists have to occasionally look over their shoulder to recognize, of course, the story that comes from the corpus of Lot and his wife escaping from the burning cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and she looks over her shoulder. The Greeks, of course, played the same game. At 3a, I can't help but think of the great thinkers Piaget and Vygotsky, clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, who talked a lot about play theory and the importance of playing for children and the ways in which we continue to play. Of course, Wittgenstein said the same thing about language. We're always playing with words. Finally, at 3b, what are your views on play? And is it possible that reading a good poem is a form of play? I hope so. Thank you.